Okay, welcome everyone. It is 7 p.m. and we will start our meeting. Welcome to the our budget presentation from Schools 52. Our meeting today takes place on the traditional and unceded territory of the Tsimshian and Smalek speaking peoples. It's a pleasure to live, work, and play here. And I too, as Chair Choi often reminds everyone that it is a personal responsibility. Learning and the microphone. And I'm attending the regional equity session in Smithers with Chair Toy and Roberta Zerza and members for department, the Indigenous Education Council this Friday. With that, we will start our meeting. And so I'm asking if Jerry Slakus could join us online and Brittany Verissimo, and they will start our presentation today.
Okay, thanks everyone. Okay, thanks for having us. This report to the ABC committee, which seems fitting that this is education. We're doing ABCs. If we could go to the first slide, Brittany. So I always like to remind us of where we are in the budget process because it seems to go on all year. And so the top part of this is what we went through just recently with the amended budget, which was approved back in February. It starts when we have our September 30th student count and work through to amending the budget that was approved the previous spring. And then we move into the current process that we're in for the preliminary budget for next year. If you could just advance that, Chris or Brittany. And so you can see we start a bunch of preliminary planning in January and February. Actually, at the same time, we're still finalizing the amended budget. And then the ministry announces the funding in middle of March. And then we do some work with the committees and the board, coming to where we are right now with where we've got some preliminary work. And then for final approval in the May and June board meetings. So where we're at right now is what we're presenting is we've just taken a very high level look at the budget for next year. There's some costs that we knew would not be continuing into next year, some one-time things. We're aware of the ministry funding. So we've taken the enrollment projections from Andrew and his team and the ministry funding rates and applied that as well as the ins and outs of the budget that we're aware of. So it's still at a very high level. But it gives us an understanding of where we're sitting. Do we have a deficit for next year? Do we have a surplus and how big that is? Because that of course governs how we address the detailed review of the budget. So which will be continuing on for the rest of this month. So with that said, everything we're presenting right now is still very preliminary and fairly high level. So just so you know, there's a fair bit of work still to be done on this. So next slide. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on the presentation around our operating grant because it's such a big factor to us. It's by far the largest portion of our revenue. And so I just wanted to spend some time on that. This is our current year budget for the operating grant. And you can see the top part is all driven by the number of FTEs or students that we have in the different categories. And those are the rates that we get for that. So for a regular K-12 student, we get $7,885. And then for alternate students, a similar amount. And for homeschool students, it's just a small amount. And then for special needs, English language learners and Indigenous students, we get a top up to that. So a level 1 student, we would receive the $7,885 plus that $44,850. It's quite a large amount. But as you can see, there's only 2 of them in the whole district. So there's a fairly significant criteria for them to meet in their assessment to get there. And then for adult students, so again, very small numbers, but we get a reduced amount, 5,000 instead of the 7,885. And then there are a number of factors that take into account the differences for this district. So the salary differential is based on the average teacher cost in our district versus the average teacher costs in the rest of the province. So it tries to equalize that in districts where it might be higher or lower. The unique geographic takes into account everything from how sparsely populated you are, how spread out you are, even the climate, so how many degree days of heating and cooling you have. A rural high school generates a fair bit of money, those kind of things. So it tries to make, tries to help, especially the small and the rural and northern districts with some extra funding versus the smaller or the large urban districts that have a lot of students packed into a small area. So that tries to recognize that. The enrollment decline and the funding protection trying to spread out when you have a decline in enrollment. It tries to spread the financial impact of that out over a couple of years. And so, so it helps with that. And next year we have a small decline as well. So we'll be seeing some of that. The equity of opportunity has to do with kind of the socioeconomic status of our students. It looks at how many children in care we have, how many of our students' families are below the average income levels, those kind of things. And it creates an indices for each district, and we get some extra funding for that. The LEA recovery is our agreements with the Indigenous bands, and the ministry deducts any students that are on the nominal roll, as they call it, students on reserve that are attending our schools, and they give that money to the bands, and then we through our agreement, we bill them back for that. So it gives them some autonomy and say in how we're delivering education programs to their students. So that comes down to 23 million base funding, and then due to the collective agreements that were signed after the funding had been announced, the per student funding, so they just block funded us for the labor settlement amounts for the support staff, the teachers, and the exempt and principal vice principal group. So quite a sizable amount of money there, around $1 million just to pay for the cost of those collective agreements and those wage settlements. So overall, $24.5 million just from our operating grant for the district for this year. So I went through that fairly quickly. Any questions on that before I continue? I can't see hands, so you probably have to yell out. But...
No questions.
Okay. All right, the next slide. So then we move to what's changed for next year. So the first column is, sorry, I'm just trying to get a picture of all of us out of the way. There we go. Is what we're projecting for next year for our operating grant. The middle blue section is what we just looked at, the operating grant for this year. And then the far section shows the total change. And so this is the whole thing. We're going to zoom in a little bit. So we'll go to the next slide so you can see this a little bit better. And we'll just take the top part first. Here we go. So as you can see, we're projecting 1,721 students for next year versus 1,763 this year. So it's a drop of 42 students. And then if you look below that, we've got some corresponding drops in Indigenous students, ELL students, and level 2 students. So there you can see, you know, it's a fairly decent decline in enrollment, and of course our funding drops with that. However, we do have a $740 increase in our rates from $78.85 to $86.25. So that helps offset that decline in enrollment. And then we have the similar increases to all the other top-ups that we get. So it works out to about a 9.5% increase. And that's to cover the 4% increase in 22-23, as well as the 5.5% increase that was for next year's collective agreement increases. So, and then there you can see the impact of that on our total grants. So a $940,000, for example, increase in the K-12 students and so on. The next slide. there. And then similar changes to some of these. One good news item this year was that our unique geographic factors, which are not enrollment based, went up $340,000. So that was a pleasant change. We hadn't seen a change or increase in that in quite a while, so that was nice to see. And then a little bit increase in our enrollment decline funding, and that's due to that 42 student drop. So they try to spread that out over a couple of years. So unfortunately, we'll get a little more money this year, but we'll lose it next year. So it's just a temporary. And then our funding protection, we're going to see some of that get repaid, about $229,000. That's a harder one to estimate, but this is the ministry's estimate at this time. And so we'll see how that holds up, but that's the best estimate we have at this time. And then subtotal is about a 1.5 million dollar increase overall. However, if you look at the bottom, we lose that labor settlement funding that we got in the current year because it's now been rolled into the base rates. So part of that increase from 78.85 to 86.25 was the labor settlement funding for the 22-23 year, and the rest was for the funding for the 23-24 year. So if you look at the very bottom, then we have a net increase of $644,000 in our operating grant for next year. So a whole bunch of numbers, and then they're just going to make it a little more complicated by breaking that $644,000 out into the different sources of that. So the first three columns are the total change, which we saw at the very beginning. But then what I've done is breaking it out between how much was generated by the increase in rates, how much was generated by the enrollment change, and then the other increases, decreases in the last column. So overall, you can see that the rate increase, came to $1.8 million almost. We took out this year's labor settlement, so it was a net increase of $846,000 for next year, just based on the per student amounts. So that would be essentially the labor settlement covering the cost of the support and the teacher wage increases for next year. That does not include anything for the exempt and principal, vice principal. They haven't said that they won't fund that, but they haven't said whether they will for sure or not. And that's about a $250,000 amount. So we're still very hopeful that we'll see them fund that, but I'm not sure when they will announce that, hopefully sometime this spring. The middle column then is the enrollment. You can see the impact on, 364,000 just in the K-12 group, offset a little bit by the increase of 136,000 in enrollment decline. So for a net cost to us of 316,000 out of our operating grant. And then the last one is, mainly to do with the unique geographic factors I mentioned, 340 increase, but then a loss of some of our funding protection of 229,000. So a net increase of 114,000. So those three amounts then essentially make up our total increase in the operating grant: 846,000 for the rate increase, a loss of 300,000 for the enrollment decline, and then an increase of 114,000 for other factors. So the net of 644. So we try to break it out. Hopefully it would be more helpful if you could see them split out that way. I know it helped Brittany and I understand it better. So if it didn't work for you, at least it was good for us to understand it. Any questions?
Yes, Trustee Horn.
Thank you, Andrew. Jerry, I know they were talking for the longest time about putting in a new funding model. This is not the new funding model, I take it, but it's just the old model adjusted.
Yeah, and they seem to have backed off this whole idea of a new funding model. I think probably scared them because they were going to be winners and losers, and I think the people who thought they were going to be losers probably made a lot of noise. But either way, the ministry has backed off on going to a new funding model.
And then a second part of my question, if I could. I know we've argued to the government and many districts have the extra cost of inflation. Is that, do you know if that's specifically put in there as in those increased numbers, or do
No.
you not?
I don't think so, because the increase in the individual rates just looked very similar to the percentage increase for the wage settlements. Where we did possibly that could be inflation is that increase to our unique geographic factors, that $340,000. That could have been some of that. They didn't tell us why they increased that amount. And we certainly were happy to take it, but I suspect that's might be part of a little bit of an inflationary amount. It's been a long time since we've seen any funding for inflation beyond the collective agreement increases.
Thank you.
No other questions?
Oh, that's it for now.
Okay. Slide. I'll turn it over to Brittany.
Thanks, Jerry. So this slide shows our revenue change from this year's current amended budget to next year's preliminary budget. The first column is the 23-24 preliminary budget. The second column is the 22-23 amended budget. The third column is the change between the two, showing either the increase or decrease in dollars. And the fourth column is showing the change as a percentage. Jerry just discussed the increase of $644,000 in ministry operating grants, so I won't go into detail here again. In addition, there are some other ministry grants which we estimate to have a net decrease of $24,000. There is an investment income increase of $28,000, and this is due to an increase in interest rates. This next slide shows our expense change from this year's current amended budget to next year's preliminary budget. This is just a quick overview, big picture look at where we're at. We have identified some known changes and are working on completing the more detailed analysis. This quick overview gives us a good starting point as we dive deeper into the more detailed budget analysis. As a reminder, these are currently estimates and will change. Again, just going over the columns, the first column is the 23-24 preliminary budget. The second column is the 22-23 amended budget. The third column is the change between the two, showing either the increase or decrease in dollars. And the fourth column is showing the change as a percentage. So now just going down the list. First, sorry, I'll state that the wage increase resulted in an increase of about 5.5%. As you go down the fourth column, you'll notice that some of the categories have a different percentage change. I'll go down the list and explain these changes. Teachers have a lower percentage change due to an estimated student enrollment decrease next year. As student enrollment decreases, this results in us also decreasing teacher FTE. I would just like to clarify that teachers have a wage increase of 5.5%. The reason that this increase is only 4.2% for teachers on this slide is because of the decrease in teachers due to the student enrollment decrease. Going down on the list, education assistants have a lower percentage as we did an analysis and discovered that the average cost we used for EAs was higher than actual. Again, to clarify, education assistants will also have a wage increase of 5.5%. The reason that there's a decrease of 4.1% for EAs on this slide is because of the decrease in average EA cost used for next year's budget. And then going down, other professionals have a lower percentage as this year's amended budget included salary continuance, which we will no longer incur next year. Once again, to clarify, other professionals also have a wage increase of 5.5%. The reason for this decrease of 5.7 for other professionals on this slide is due to the salary continuance not incurred in next year's budget. The employee benefits change is mainly due to the increase in wages. As wages increase, employee benefits also increase. There was also an increase in CPP and EI and some premiums. I know that was a lot of information, so I'll just pause and see if there's any questions.
Trustee Horn.
I see the last number, services employer supply, sir, has decreased 5.4% against what amended budget said. So this is for next year's preliminary budget. Is there a particular reason why we budgeted lower on that number?
Yeah, so I'll actually go in further
Are we
detail
going
as
that
I
later?
go.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, one
Oh,
more
yeah.
question, which may be more pointed to Andrew. Andrew, principal, vice principal numbers, total numbers, is there a point, once the student numbers have been dropping steadily, is there a point where we reduce the number of those positions? At some point, do we?
At some point, there probably will be. You know, if schools get really small,
But that's not yet, right?
but our enrollment decline, and again, this is a projection. And so our projection for 1,775 students versus what might happen if students move into the district. So we're not planning a decline right now.
Thank you.
Often what can happen too is rather than eliminate positions is you have your administrators do more time teaching and less administration. So they could, go from 1.5 days teaching to 2 days teaching, for example, if the enrollment drops enough. So there is a savings in those cases. Sorry to jump in, Andrew.
Thank you for that.
Okay, Brittany, continue.
All right, moving on to the next slide. So this is our services and supplies breakdown of the different categories included in here. This is just an overview, and I'll go into more detail on a later slide. So on this slide, this is an overview of the big picture of where we're at. Currently, we're sitting at an estimated shortfall of 311,000. Next, I'll go through the internally restricted changes and then go into more detail on some of the revenue and expense changes we just went over. At this point, we are using the assumption that the school surplus and the Indigenous education surplus that will be carried forward from this year to next year will be the same as this year. This is just the assumption we are using right now. The next two amounts are items we drew from reserves to balance this year's budget. Therefore, we won't have them again for next year. The last item, the capital asset purchase, budgeted at 60,000 for next year, is to purchase a maintenance vehicle. This brings us to our estimated shortfall of 311,000.
Trustee Horn.
Apologize for all my questions.
No, that's great.
Drawn from internally restricted, can you please explain what we did last on the amended budget last year? Why that's there and what it was and where it came from, what it is.
Jerry, do you want to take this one?
Jerry, you're muted.
That's good. I sound more intelligent that way. So I just point out my spreadsheet. Yeah, there was a few items. One was, I'm just going through them. Surpluses. There were some planned projects for general maintenance of IT. There was 128,000 set aside in internally restricted. There was some training money of $25,000. There were capital projects of which there was 100,000 for an IT, a new payroll finance systems. That was 226,000, so that was quite a large amount. So those were the big items coming out of internally restricted. Those three big ones: the planned projects 128, training of 25, and then capital projects of 226.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Actually, sorry, to carry on that same vein now, we're not expecting any of those costs to reappear this budget season, right? 23-24 preliminary budget.
So at this point, no, we're just assuming not, but that can be a discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, and I have a question for Dinesh. Can you see the other trustees in case they raise their hands? Just on your laptop? Okay.
So either they can just.
They can unmute.
Let them know that. Oh, if the trustees who are online have questions, I can't see you, but if you just make yourself known that you have a question, we will acknowledge you.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to the next slide. This is a summary of the changes from the revenue and expense statements we just went through. I'll go over these again in further detail on the following 2 slides. So the figures on these next 2 slides are the total changes from the current year to next year, which we have been discussing. To recap the revenue changes, the Ministry of Education and Childcare grants have an increase of $620,000. The investment income has an estimated increase of $28,000 due to receiving higher interest rates. The salaries and benefits overall changes are due to wage increases, average cost correction, enrollment, and wage continuance. Going down the list, wage increase of 1.342 million. The wage increase is currently at an increase of about 5.5%, but will be 6.75% as was just announced. The additional increase is due to the cost of living increase as part of the negotiated wage settlements. This additional increase of 1.25% will be reflected in our next budget presentation. The average cost correction decrease of 214,000. This is due to when we did an analysis, we discovered that the average cost reused for EAs was higher than actual costs. If you recall, when we presented the February financials, our EA category was under budget, and we believe that this is the reason for that. As a reminder, when we build our budget, we use estimates. And then as a normal course of business, we check those estimates against actual. This is part of the reason why we do variance analysis. It's not just to see how we're doing financially, but to test our budget estimates and assumptions and make adjustments as necessary. Going next down on the list, enrollment decrease of 170,000. This enrollment decrease is due to an estimated student enrollment decrease, which results in a teacher decrease. This is normal practice. As student enrollment goes up or down, teacher staffing also goes up or down. Wage continuance decrease of 211,000. Wage continuance was included in this year's budget, but won't be included in next year's budget.
Trustee Young.
On that last one, where you said the wage continuance will be included in this year's budget, but not in next year's budget, why would that be? Why would it not carry on in next year as well?
So when we incur that expense, it's all incurred in the current year.
So that'll come later, like if it gets incurred again, it will come in then?
If there's a new one.
Yeah, right.
Yes, yeah. Any other questions? Moving on. Next, I'll go over the more detailed breakdown of the supplies and services changes. Again, the figures on this slide are the total changes from the current year to next year. First, we'll go over the services changes. Trustee elections has a decrease of 12,000. 2022 was an election year, therefore we won't have this cost next year. Audit cost has a decrease of 75,000. This is regarding an audit that the work is scheduled to be completed this year. Therefore, we don't expect to have this cost next year. Legal cost has a decrease of a net amount of 800. We are expecting to have less legal costs next year. Architect cost has a decrease of 70,000. This decrease is because we expect the majority of architect costs for next year to be allocated to capital projects. This means they'll be included in capital and not in operating expense. Software licensing cost has an increase of 11,800. This increase is due to an increase in the annual renewal cost of our accounting software. Other contracted services cost has a decrease of 65,000. In the current year, this included the Public Development Review, PDR, for the middle school. We will not have this cost next year. This brings us to a total decrease of 201,000 in services. Next, we'll go over the changes to supplies. School generated funds has a decrease of 27,000. This is just a correction to the current year budget. Grounds maintenance supplies cost has an increase of 10,000. We noticed that the current year budget was inadequate for this year, so we have increased it for next year. Computer equipment cost has an increase of 47,000. This is the next generation network cost that was missed in the current year budget. This is where the ministry has been updating the network capacity for the schools around the province. The one-time grant has a decrease of 7,000. This was related to a one-time grant for a school in the current year. So this brings us to a total supplies increase of $23,075.
Trustee Horn.
Surprising. Sorry, on supplies, software licensing percentage of the total, what is that number as a percentage of the total?
So,
If you can't answer that right now, I'll take it later.
yeah, I'll get
That'd be
back to
good,
you.
thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Chair Toy.
Just a comment. Thank you so much for the way this is laid out and how beautiful this is to follow, and also projections, and just thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Moving on. So this is a slide that we've included just regarding the public and partner group feedback. There were various consultation opportunities where feedback has been received. We had an online survey for the public to submit their feedback, and we received 13 responses. We also had 2 submissions from the public. We also had a meeting dedicated to giving our partner groups an opportunity to present their input. The 4 groups that presented were Prince Rupert Principals and Vice Principals Association, PRPVPA, Prince Rupert District Teachers Union, PRDTU, SD52 Indigenous Education Department, and the International Union of Operating Engineers, IUOE. We are taking this feedback into consideration as we do our more detailed review. And that's it. Are there any other questions or comments?
Trustee Horn.
I would comment back on our chair's comment about how the presentation is put forward to us. That it seems to me to be a lot clearer, like Chair said, and a lot easier for us to ask the questions that you presented to us. So thank you for that.
Thank you for the
The
feedback.
work that you've done putting it together. And to Jerry, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Comment.
Trustee
Um, yeah, I just had a question on the 13 submissions. Are we able to know that today on what comments were made, or is that going to be in a different meeting?
I believe that's posted on our website.
Brittany is
Oh, okay.
correct. They are posted on the website now. So you
Oh,
can
okay.
review them. Trustee Sanchez.
I think that was the same thing I was gonna ask about the responses, and whether they were constituted.
Yeah, so the surveys are up, and I can assure everyone that we've gone through them, and what we're doing is our analysis on costing. Some of them have requests for expenditures, and some are for cuts to either programs or to physical plants such as buildings, et cetera. And so we need to consider each one. And overall, all of the submissions will be considered and brought forward.
One more question, was one for the presentations. That was presented to people, like say for the principals, vice principals.
It was presented to us.
IUOE, we didn't get that this year.
Yeah, we were
Yeah.
there.
It
were
was a
at
public
the-
meeting.
Oh, gee, I must have missed that one then. Probably did. I was just wondering because I can't remember. Maybe it's
Yeah.
just this thing up there.
Yeah, it was the presentation where we just had the 4 groups present.
Oh, okay. Now I remember.
I've got another
I was-
question. Or sorry,
So what,
somebody else can go.
I was just gonna say, just on behalf of the Principals Association, we'd like to thank you for the presentation and thank both Gary or Jerry, sorry, is it? And
Jerry.
Brittany. It was it sounds like all of us feel like it's very informative and really broken down and very well done. So we'd just like to thank you for that.
Thank you for the feedback.
Trustee Mayor?
Yeah, I agree with everyone on how well this has been put together, and I appreciate that. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding what was presented though. So with our decline comes a decline in teaching positions, a decline in EA, like an overall decline, and that has already been, that's already put in the budget. So our cuts of 311,000 will come on top of what that is, correct? Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that I was understanding it. All right, thank you so much.
Trustee Horn?
When we're at the end, after questions in, can we get what we're gonna do next steps?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
So if there are no further questions, the next steps, and I just want to say, so it's in my role as superintendent, this is a 30,000-foot view. This is the first pass over looking at all the numbers and trying to crunch them together to see where we are. And in some places, we don't have complete information. We don't know what our enrollment will be, and that is a big driver of a lot of what we do. You know, we are projecting 1,775, but our enrollment could change either way. So we have to be prepared for that. And again, it's there's a lot of estimates that we put into the budget, and there's a lot of assumptions that we make, but this is just a preliminary pass. Over the next few days, we continue to refine the budget as more information comes in and as staff continue to talk about their individual schools and different operations. So the next public board meeting is on Tuesday, April 18th. That is a regular board meeting, and that's here at 7 p.m. and online. On Thursday, April 20th, we'll have a budget meeting. And this is to further, where trustees will discuss the budget in greater detail, and we'll look at some scenarios. So that's on Thursday, April 20th at 7 p.m., both online and here in the booth building. And with that, if there are no further questions, our meeting is adjourned. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.